أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد المصطفى النبي الأمي الطيب الطاهر الزكي صلاة تنحل بها العقد وتنفرج بالكرب بعد آله وأصحابه أجمعين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد المصطفى النبي الأمي الطيب الطاهر الزكي صلاة تنحل بها العقد وتنفرج بالكرب بعد آله وأصحابه أجمعين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد المصطفى النبي الأمي الطيب الطاهر الزكي صلاة تنحل بها العقد وتنفرج بالكرب بعد آله وأصحابه أجمعين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد المصطفى النبي الأمي الطيب الطاهر الزكي صلاة تنحل بها العقد وتنفرج بالكرب على آله وأصحابه أجمعين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد المصطفى النبي الأمي الطيب الطاهر الزكي صلاة تنحل بالعقد وتنفرج بالكرب على آله وأصحابه أجمعين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد المصطفى النبي الأمي الطيب الطاهر الزكي صلاة تنحل بالعقد وتنفرج بالكرب على آله وأصحابه أجمعين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد المصطفى النبي الأمي الطيب الطاهر الزكي صلاة تنحل بالعقد وتنفرج بالكرب على آله وأصحابه أجمعين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد المصطفى النبي الأمي الطيب الطاهر الزكي صلاة تنحل بالعقد وتنفرج بالكرب على آله وأصحابه أجمعين. اللهم صل وسلم بأنواع كمالاتك في جميع تجلياتك على سيدنا ومولانا محمد أول الأنوار الفائضة من بحور عظمة الذات المتحقق في عالم البطون والظهور بمعاني الأسماء والصفات، فهو أول حامد ومتعبد بأنواع العبادات والقربات، والممد في عالم الأرواح والأشباح لجميع الموجودات، وعلى آله وأصحابه صلاة تكشف لنا النقاب عن وجه الكريم في المراء واليقظات، وتعرفنا بك وبه في جميع المراتب والحضارات، والطفنا مولانا بجاهه في الحركات والسكنات واللحظات والخطرات، والطفنا مولانا بجاهه في الحركات والسكنات واللحظات والخطرات، والطفنا مولانا بجاهه في الحركات والسكنات واللحظات والخطرات. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. And last time we got up to note 49. Which is on page 40 of the Kant book. So 49 is where it refers to Kant's ready faculty dedicated to the production of such fancies of transcendental illusion, that is, traditional metaphysics. So Maulana Yusuf, can you read from Kant has a ready faculty dedicated to the production of such fancies? And then when you get to notes, apart from 49, because you did that last time, just stop and I'll read the note. Okay, but could you shout? Because actually this microphone is not too bad. Further, Maulana, thanks.
Kant has a ready faculty dedicated to the production of such fancies of transcendental illusion, and this is reason. Reason's ideas of pure reason are concepts that, unlike the categories of the understanding, are not employed in the constitution alongside sensible intuitions of objects.
A concept made up of notions which goes beyond the possibility of experience is an idea or a concept of reason. So that's from Samahatuhu's CPR B377.
Instead, they purport to depict noumenal realities in general and in themselves. But this is really a mere grasping amongst concepts.
Yes.
Concepts that arise from nothing beyond themselves and that are rooted in nothing in reality.
Plato is again a target here, epitomizing in his work the misguided attempt to use concepts beyond their proper application in intuitions. Plato made use of the expression idea in such a way that we can readily see that he understood by it something that not only could never be borrowed from the senses, but that even goes far beyond the concepts of the understanding with which Aristotle occupied himself. Since nothing encountered in experience could ever be congruent to it, ideas for him are archetypes of things themselves and not, like the categories, merely the key to possible experiences. In his opinion, they flowed from the highest reason through which human reason partakes in them. Our reason, however, now no longer finds itself in its original state, but must call back with toil the old, now very obscure ideas through a recollection, which is called philosophy. Kant then notes, without excessive modesty, we understand him even better than he understood himself.
Reason, for Kant, is incorrigibly prone to seek after a chimera. It cannot but seek for the unconditioned, and this is a natural and unavoidable illusion which itself rests upon subjective principles and passes them off as objective. Reason, in inferring, seeks to bring the greatest manifold of cognition of the understanding to the smallest number of principles, universal conditions, and thereby to effect the highest unity of that manifold.
Also, due to the motive force yielding transcendental illusion, quote, there will be syllogisms containing no empirical premises, by means of which we can infer from something which we are acquainted, something with which we are acquainted, to something of which we have no concept, and yet to which we nevertheless, by an unavoidable illusion, give objective reality. That's from A 339, B 397. A and B refers to his first and second edition. They're usually published together, and the second edition adds very substantial content. Now, quote, something of which we have no concept, and yet to which we nevertheless, by an unavoidable illusion, give objective reality. Could not some of Kant's critical first assumptions, see also the note directly below, fall quite comfortably under this rubric? The understanding and the sensibility are separate faculties, and they are the sine qua non of genuine knowledge, for example.
Of course, with his immense powers, Kant seems to have been able to combat this ineluctable and primitive inclination to unify in order to carry out his critique by an act of will.
That's good, Habibi, shukran. So just to go back to note 53, and then we'll stop reading there for a while and go to half of Hasan's book. So, so in note 53, he talks about syllogisms that contain no empirical premises, by means of which we can infer from something with which we are acquainted to something of which we have no concept, and yet to which we nevertheless, by an unavoidable illusion, give objective reality. So Kant is talking about the ideas of pure reason. And if we go back to note 50, he defines that as a concept made up of notions which goes beyond the possibility of experience, is an idea or a concept of reason. So a concept made up of notions which goes beyond the possibility of experience is an idea or a concept of reason. So the only purely intelligible properties, that is, concepts which are not intuitions, they're not directly related to a sensible particular, the only ones which are legitimate in Kant's view are the ones which are meant to be applied to your intuitions. They illuminate your intuitions. Concepts without intuitions are empty because they don't uncover any real reality. They're just pure abstractions, right? For him, a concept has to always pertain to an empirical particular in some way or other, right? And intuitions without concepts are blind because they're not really seeing anything. There is some content there, but they don't. But the intuition itself doesn't know really what it is. It doesn't have the full intelligibility. So the pure intuition of time and space, right, without the categories, right, of relation and of substance and of all of the categories and of unity and so on, doesn't reveal the world that we're accustomed to. It's simply, and again, it's per impossibile, because you can't have an intuition on its own anyway, and you can't have a concept on its own anyway for Kant. But in any case, so the good concepts are the concepts of the understanding, which he calls categories. Those are the ones that he's willing to countenance. They're absolutely necessary for experience and for genuine cognition. But his problem is when you abstract those pure intelligible properties, those pure concepts, from their context, the only legitimate context, which is in informing our cognition of particulars, right? So in naive notions of empiricism, which he beautifully calls out and very correctly calls out, there isn't even any reference to concepts. And insofar as people like Hume and Locke deal with concepts, they deal with them in a very crude manner and always very quickly and facilely assume that they are reducible to empirical experience. Whereas what Kant realizes is that they are part and parcel of empirical experience. They can't be reduced to somehow some empirical element which is more fundamental than they are, because they will always be presupposed in any cognition of an empirical thing. So they are the necessary non-empirical framework without which it's impossible to have empirical cognition. So he realizes keenly the problem of intelligible properties, which are irreducible. They can't be reduced to empirical particulars, but he thinks nonetheless their only legitimate use is as applied to empirical particulars. And the whole problem with traditional metaphysics, and the whole lie of traditional metaphysics, is that it tries to abstract purely intelligible properties from their only real context and their only legitimate use, which is in illuminating the nature of the empirical world, and carries out what he calls this grasping amongst concepts, which they imagine is leading to the uncovering of genuine and new knowledge and real knowledge about the intelligible structure of reality. That's why he says general ontology is impossible and special metaphysics is impossible. What he means by general ontology is knowledge of the general intelligible structure of the world. So you might say the umur amma, for example, although this is not usually adequately affirmed in the kalam tradition, and you have to really dig deep to try to find to encounter real statements of this, but you could say, for example, the umur amma represent an account of the general intelligible structure of reality, i.e., every reality must be a being, which is basically tautological. It must be an individual. It must be Karim Laham just sent me a hilarious thing which I have to share with you. Can you put this over your head? No, I'm just kidding. It's I'll just share it with some of you here. Yeah. Anyway, the Umur Amma could be considered one iteration of that intelligible structure. The transcendentals could be considered, the medieval transcendentals could be considered, but there are far more integral and holistic and convincing accounts which are genuinely exemplary in the account of causation, which you'll find in the broadly Platonic and Akbarian traditions about the general structure of intelligible reality. And it's true that for Kant, I mean, Kant is right, I think, to a large extent, that much immanentist traditional metaphysics is just a grasping amongst concepts. And it doesn't mean that there isn't much of great interest there. But it's just that it's not really transcending the level of mere concepts. Now, how does reason create this illusion for Kant? Reason creates this illusion, if you look at the quotation from the CPR that we just read on page 41, it creates this illusion in the following manner. Reason, in inferring, this is how it naturally operates, seeks to bring the greatest manifold, the greatest multiplicity of cognition, of the understanding, to the smallest number of principles, universal conditions, and thereby to effect with an E, the highest unity of that manifold, ultimately culminating in God. So this is how reason naturally operates. Remember, Kant says human reason cannot help but set goals for itself. It can't help setting goals for itself, which it can't answer by its very nature. So he would agree that we're metaphysical animals and we can't stop being thus. It's just that we can't actually answer the questions that we set for ourselves. We can't stop setting them because of the nature of the structure of our reason, but the nature of our cognitive apparatuses dictates that genuine knowledge resulting from the exercise of pure reason, i.e., concepts not applied to intuitions, cannot but result in transcendental illusion, as he calls it, which is us thinking that we have uncovered genuine ontological realities or the general structure of being, when in fact we haven't. We're just grasping amongst concepts. How does it do this? It's because by its very structure, reason in inferring seeks to bring the greatest manifold of cognition of the understanding to the smallest number of principles, right? So we're always looking at a manifold and saying, well, what do these have in common, right? And if you look at, traditional, let's say the Porphyrian tree, you're talking about, or in traditional logic, it talks about the jins, ويرسم بأنه كلي مقول على كثيرين مختلفين بالحقائق في جواب ما هو, right? So the jins is a universal which is said of kathirina, manifold, lots of things, مختلفين بالحقائق, which have different essences, في جواب ما هو, in the answer to what is it. So we're always trying to create these unities, and the same with the species, even when there are things of the same character, which are the individuals, so when the knower is يرسم بأنه كليا مقول على كثيرين مختلفين بالعدد دون الحقيقة, right? That only differ in number. So we say number one, human number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but we're all the same. So we differ in individuality, but we don't differ in. But nonetheless, we try to find the principle of unity. That's how we cognize the world, right? And we keep on trying to do that. So then we have the cognition of the whole human race, and we say, oh, there's human nature. We say in their characterization of it, we look at the whole of the aggregate of all of the objects of experience that we have, and we call it the world, for example. There's no the world, really. There's just individual experiences that lots of people have, and then we imagine this thing called the world. And by the world, I mean, the universe, everything, all what is in principle knowable, even if that knowledge is not actualized within time and space, as in what is in principle knowable within time and space. And we keep on going. We say, well, there must be a principle of all things, corporeal and non-corporeal. Let's say we have intelligible properties, empirical properties, and then we end up with the source of all being, and he's saying this is how our reason naturally operates. But I'm showing in the Critique of Pure Reason that even though it looks like that's where you're getting, all you're uncovering is a transcendent, what you think has ontological import, is the transcendent being underlying the world. All you're really getting to is that concept of the transcendent being which underlies the world. All you're getting to is the ultimate irreducible concept of unity, right? You're not getting to the actual being, which is the ground of that concept. So reason and inferring seeks to bring the greatest manifold of cognition of the understanding to the smallest number of principles, universal conditions, thereby to affect the highest unity of that manifold. So that's what reason and most particularly, more specifically, the ideas of pure reason, seeks to do. So, for example, as I've said before, if you were to say that everything in the world is a possible being, because everything which is, first of all, possible, he's saying, right? We have to be careful with that word, possible. So everything in the world is a possible being, because if you look at its existence in relation to its essence, it didn't have to be there. If Samuel didn't have to be there, there could just have easily been Samuel here from, Norway or something, who replaces Samuel. Samuel never came into existence, but there was Samuel from Norway here, for example. I fundamentally disagree with this, because I highly value Samuel as a person, but the world wouldn't have been any the poorer, because he's not a necessary being, right? His existence is completely superfluous. All of our existence is completely superfluous. I wouldn't have been Hasan, I would have been Hayden, right? From Stratford, right? Doing exactly the same thing, but I'm just slightly different. And I don't have to exist. None of us have to exist. So we're all possible beings, and and the particular configuration. Trees, they don't have to be like that, and all you have to imagine is some sort of some sort of sci-fi world where trees look different, or sci-fi world where they're like June, where there are 3 suns, there's not one. And so the point is that all of those contingent facts, they didn't have to be like that. So the idea is that we are fundamentally, we're possible beings. With respect to ourselves, we don't have existence, right? And so there has to be something to preponderate, to cause the preponderance of existence over non-existence, and it can't be the thing itself, and it can't be other contingent things, because the aggregate can't magically take on a quality which the individuals don't have on their own, and therefore we end up. So what Kant would say is, well, that is just this process of trying to bring the greatest manifold of cognition of the understanding to the smallest number of principles. And what you're doing there is you're using the word contingent and the word necessary, because you're saying the contingent being has to have had its existence given to it by the necessary being, beyond the boundaries of possible experience, whereas contingent possible only refers to something you can experience. And it's not transitive. It's not when you've suddenly decided that everything's a contingent being, you suddenly magic the necessary being into existence. So this is the use of concepts beyond possible experience. We don't have any possible experience of a necessary being. We only have possible experience, because he talks about possible experiences, that the fusion of intuition and concept. So we only have possible experience of individual empirical being. And that notion of possibility only makes sense insofar as it somehow pertains to an empirical property, or constitutes the transcendental conditions of any empirical cognition. Because again, he's not saying, like the positivists, that all intelligible properties are reducible to empirical properties. He's saying that they are transcendental conditions of the possibility of empirical cognitions. So he would reject that as simply being a grasping amongst concepts. Yes, contingency is transitive to necessity conceptually, but that doesn't mean it's uncovering an actual being that is necessary. And that's simply because there's no possible experience of that being. So we're just moving conceptually. We're not experiencing the being which is putatively grounding that necessity. So that's Kant's thing. He does believe that reason seeks to unify the manifold. It can't stop doing that. It will always do that forever. but he doesn't believe that that thereby uncovers a genuine intelligible structure of being, or that it can tell us anything about real beings in terms of special metaphysics. And he understands the importance of unity in terms of the transcendental unity of our perception, because he realizes that no cognition whatsoever is possible unless intuitions and concepts are all being unified in me, in my cognition of myself and my awareness of my own inward reality, in which these elements are being unified. But again, that's not a real principle of unity. That doesn't uncover my real, genuine, noumenal self, which he doesn't rule out as a possibility, but he asserts for certain that we can't ever in principle, even in principle, have knowledge of it. So it's another veiling. That transcendental unity of our perception, again, doesn't reveal a real being, which is that unifying soul. It's just one of the exigencies of experience, is that it has to be unified. Now, the good thing is, as clever as all that sounds, it's actually a complete load of nonsense. And this is a work, an absolutely brilliant work, and Hasan in general is absolutely brilliant. Sadly, he died in 2020. It looks like probably from COVID, because he was young. Someone called Werner Beerwaltes, who's the teacher of Douglas Headley, my supervisor. He was also his teacher, and he was one of the great proponents in the 20th century of Platonism as a living tradition. And he was one of the great opponents of Heidegger, although he very much sympathized with many aspects of Heidegger's project and acknowledged the greatness of much of his work, but he responded especially to his distortion and misrepresentations about Platonism. So this is chapter 3, the Metaphysics of the One. You can also find this in the Routledge Handbook to Neoplatonism, which is an absolutely brilliant book. The amazing thing is, as a traditionalist, you're not supposed to say ever that anything is getting better, or that any scholarships are getting better, or that anything. But we're not traditionalists, we're hopefully traditional. And the truth is, Platonism is in a much better state now than it has been for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it really is undergoing a renaissance right now, because of people like Findlay and Jens Hasan and Gerson, despite his unfortunate Aristophilia, and many others. The work that's going on right now really is a huge leap forward. And the main reason for that is just rejecting the Schleiermachian assumption of the unsystematicity of Plato, and the fundamental assumption that he didn't really have any unwritten doctrines. There's no real Platonic tradition, and the Neoplatonists are just they're just syncretists who are making up a lot of stuff and pretending that they're just commentators on Plato. As soon as people started to question that in a serious, systematic manner, they realized that, hold on, if we look at the same material, not assuming all that Enlightenment nonsense, then everything makes much more sense. And so I wouldn't say it's standard. I mean, what would that mean anyway? But it's a very serious, legitimate, and I would say the dominant position now in the academy on this matter is that the Neoplatonists, in their claim to be merely commentators on Plato, are actually basically telling the truth. Doesn't mean they don't draw on Aristotle and the Stoics and whatever, but they are basically telling the truth, because basically, if you really try to find dispassionately the Neoplatonist ontology and metaphysics and epistemology in Plato, you do find it. and that's what they were claiming. So anyway, this is an absolute, so what I was saying about the Routledge Handbook, this article, which is from this book, which is translated to English very recently, is also in that handbook. So I'm just going to read it, and it's about 5 pages of reading. Let's, anyone who wants to stop me either live or not live, please go ahead at any moment. So, because I really want us to grasp this. So yeah.
Can I ask about Kant's book? Can I ask now or after you?
Further.
So to make sure, it's a bit basic, but to make sure about the relation, I think you said it right because I wrote it from you last time, was the concepts without intuition, empty, and intuition of the concept lines.
Yeah.
So can we say the concepts and intuition for him is a عموم خصوص مطلق, in some sense, that any intuition is based on a concept, but some concept does not have intuition, and those do it because there's no empirical way of them, so it's impossible for us to know. So for him, it's only the knowledge is possible when they both align, right? Is that right?
Well, to expel out the عموم خصوص مطلق of them.
So for each intuition, there must be a concept underpinning it,
Right.
in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
But this is not true for concepts. Not every concept that the brain think of can have like an empirical intuition.
No, because not every intuition has to have a concept. It's possible to artificially separate them in the mind. He's saying the real, in their real application, what constitutes justifiable real knowledge is their synthesis, right? But no, you can very much consider intuitions on their own. You can very much consider concepts on their own. Yes, they should go together, right? But it's not, although that's a very good thought, it's not quite عموم خصوص مطلق in the sense that, and again, that's in terms of predication, don't forget. So that would be every concept is an intuition or the other way around, and some is not, which is not the case. He's not identifying them. But you're talking about in terms of a relation, which is a different branch of logic you're going to have to develop now. That's in our modern tafsir.
Is this the right? So it's in the opposite way of it, right?
Yeah.
Like it's impossible to know like what's the mirage from the real water for us.
He's saying everything except what I'm saying is a mirage.
Yeah.
And then you turn around and say, Kant, how come what you're saying is a mirage? And then he just runs away as quickly as possible. His wig flapping in the wind. That's how it worked. And he was taken to task for some of these things in his lifetime. You're about to find that out. He just ignored it. Yeah. It's clear cut. It's categorical. It is. I mean, even the promoters of Kant, they admit it. You're about to find that. Then they do this very, very weak takhrij for him by trying to make him into a pragmatist or something else, which he would have hated. But yes, absolutely. So the Metaphysics of the One. If anyone has this book, it is in the reading list, I believe, that Maulana very kindly put together. Plotinus, Neoplatonism, the Transcendence of the One, Jens Hafwasser. So it's page 25. The One is the basis for being and thought. So it begins with a quotation from Plotinus. It is by the One that all beings are being, both those which are primarily being and those which are in any sense said to be amongst beings. For what could anything be if it was not one? For if things are deprived of the One, which is predicated of them, they are not those things. Plotinus's programmatic treatise on the good or the One begins with these words. They summarize the basis of his philosophy of the One, as he essentially characterizes his own thought in the shortest possible way. Let us analyze this claim in more detail. First, unity is the most essential condition for the being and the conceivableness of all things. This insight cannot be reasonably disputed. Whatever we think of as, so don't, fall for anyone who says, this is not certain. You're starting from premises which are not certain. This is as certain as it gets, and that is the Platonic claim. In fact, we can only think, so this insight cannot be reasonably disputed. Whatever we think of as existing, we already think of as a unity. In fact, we can only think of such things that are a unity in some way. We can only think of such things that are a unity in some way. The translation is not perfect. What is not one in any way does not exist with regard to thought. Parmenides had already formulated this idea. Okay, what is not one in any way does not exist with regard to thought. Parmenides had already formulated this idea, and Plato had made it the basis of his philosophy. He had pointed to the etymology of the Greek word for nothing, uden, as that which is not one, ude hen. Hen, one, henology. Ude hen, not one, Republic 478b, cf. Parmenides 166c, which is adopted by Plotinus 5211. What is not one is nothing. Therefore, everything which is necessarily one, and in such a manner that it only is for the very reason that it is one. I don't like the sentence structures in this translation. Therefore, everything which is necessarily one, and in such a manner that it only is. Okay, therefore, everything which is necessarily one, and in such a manner that it only is for the very reason that it is one. That's not good English. I'm not sure if the Routledge handbook has the same. Sorry? It's exactly the same. That something is based on the fact that it is one. Therefore, unity is the reason for being, the existence of all things, but not only that. Second, what something is, it also owes to its character as a unity, since if it were not one, it would no longer be that which in each case it is. Whatever something is, it is also that only because, and insofar as, it is a unity. It always contains its essence as a unified essence. Without a unitary character, it would be undefined. And what is completely undefined is neither something nor does it exist at all, nor can it be thought. Unity is therefore the basis of being, not only in the sense of existence, but at the same time also in the sense of being what it is, the essence or the definition of every defined entity. That is valid for all conceivable classifications. Unity is consequently also the reason for the, so Kant agrees with all of this. Unity is consequently also the reason for the thinkability of all classifications and of all conceivable entities by means of their being defined. So third, unity turns out to be not only the ontological basis for existence and essence, but also the epistemological basis for our understanding of existence and essence. Since unity is the basis for everything that is at all conceivable, even its apparent opposite, the many, namely the many insofar as it can be conceived of, is itself contingent upon the one. For if it had not become one, quote, for if it had not become one, even though it is composed of many parts, one can in no way say of it that it is. What is? That one thing, right? So, in fact, we always, so that was from 5.3.15, 12.14. Right. In fact, we always of necessity think of the many as a unity, that is to say, as a united multiplicity, and that means as a united whole, which is formed from many elementary unities, so that the conception of the many presupposes unity in a double sense, that is the unity of the totality of multiplicity, just as much as the unity of each one of its individual components. At the conclusion of his Parmenides, Plato illustrated that a radically disunited multiplicity cannot be conceived of, that it is absolutely nothing, and therefore is not many, 165e, 166c. Therefore, nothing can oppose the one, because even multiplicity is only conceivable as a unity, and therefore also presupposes the one. As a basis for the conceivability and determinateness of everything, including multiplicity, the one is without opposition or beyond it. as that which is detached from any opposite, it is the absolute. No one can dispute, that's in 6.8, which is a very important treatise on the free will of the one. No one can dispute that everything that can be conceived of can only be conceived of as a unity. Even Kant, he wouldn't try to dispute that. In fact, one of his his many manifestations of intelligence is the fact that he does prioritize unity in terms of the transcendental unity of our perception, and realizing that what reason on its own is always doing is seeking to bring the greatest manifold of cognition of the understanding to the smallest number of principles, and thereby to affect the highest unity of that manifold, right? So no one can dispute, including Kant, that everything that can be conceived of can only be conceived of as a unity, because everything that is conceivable must be defined, and definition is only possible as a unity. This insight can be interpreted in different ways, however. That unity, because it is the necessary condition for all thought, must be at the same time the basis for being as the existence and essence of all entities, as Plotinus hypothesizes. Hold on. Yeah, that's not good English. That unity, because it is the necessary condition for all thought, must be at the same time the basis for being. You should say because the existence and essence of all entities, as Plotinus hypothesizes, only results if one presupposes that the structure of being fundamentally corresponds to the structure of our thought. This unity of thought and being was first expressed by Parmenides in his very famous fragment 3. Plato had also referred to it with the sentence, "That which entirely is entirely knowable, and that which in no way is in every way unknowable." Republic 477a. This differs from an Aristotelian approach, in that the ground for being as well as knowability indeed transcends being and knowability, as we will see below. It is precisely here that an objection might be suggested. One could perhaps argue, just like Kant, this is the good thing about this school, is that they are specialists in Platonism and German idealism, right? He's not dabbling in Kant. Right, there's a lot behind this. One could perhaps argue, just like Kant, that unity is the highest principle of our reasoning faculty, by means of which we order reality according to unitary points of view, because we could not grasp them otherwise. However, it does not necessarily follow for Kant from this requirement of unity on the part of our thought that reality by itself, independent of our thought, must be a unity and must be ordered according to a unitary perspective. For Kant, the final basis for unity of our thought forms is the unity of the thinking self, the unity of subjectivity. That's the transcendental unity of our perception. Self-consciousness first places the unitary perspective in its thought, through which it apprehends and orders the diversity of the world as it is present in perception. Therefore, it produces itself, the unity of subjectivity, self-consciousness. No, it's not the real self, as I said. It's just the appearances of the self. So it produces itself the unitary nature of its classifications and the thoughts formulated through them via subjective synthesis, according to Kant. Unity for him, then, is only a subjective principle, not the basis of being. Right, now here we go. You might not think that this would be resolvable, but it is. Interestingly, Plotinus also poses the question of whether thought itself first spawns unity, without which nothing can be thought. When thought transmits that which is obtained by means of perception to us, quote, even though it is a multitude, it does not permit it to be a multitude, so that it somehow even here makes unity apparent, either by imparting unity itself, which multiplicity does not have, or by recognizing unity lying in order by means of its acute vision and uniting the reality of the many to this unity. 6:13-19-23. Plotinus then clearly formulates the alternatives. Now, here are the alternatives. To interpret our thought's anticipation for unity, either subjectively as a positing of thought itself, So it's a positing of thought, right? Or realistically and ontologically as the perception of the unitary character of being itself, which reveals itself in its orderliness. In the second case, it is thought that again extracts the unitary nature of the objective order. So it's still thought doing that, but that doesn't mean it has to be a reductive account where it's only thought doing that. So that the Platonist at no point disputes the impossibility of ignoring subjectivity or the contribution of thought itself to our presupposition of unity. Which alternative should be chosen? Plotinus provides a quasi-transcendental analysis of the conditions for the possibility of our thought. This ensures the ontological significance of our conceptual anticipation of unity and simultaneously means that the fundamental categories of thought are stable in reality. Plotinus's argumentation runs as follows. If we can only think insofar as we already presuppose unity, where both that which is thought and the intellective act, noesis, encompassing it, must possess a unitary character, then that which is presupposed by each intellective act from its very beginning cannot itself be the product of an intellective act that presupposes it. An intellective act originally positing unity would not be unitary before this position and would therefore be nothing and thus not a thought either. Right? The one presupposed by every intellective act as a condition for taking place does not therefore rest upon the subjective positioning of thought itself, but rather necessarily precedes all subjective unifying actions of thought. So again, Plotinus's argumentation runs as follows. If we can only think insofar as we already presuppose unity, where both that which is thought and the intellective act encompassing it must possess a unitary character, then that which is presupposed by each intellective act from its very beginning cannot itself be the product of an intellective act that presupposes it. An intellective act originally positing unity would not be unitary before this position and would therefore be nothing, and thus not a thought either. Right? The one presupposed by every intellective act as a condition for taking place does not therefore rest upon the subjective positioning of thought itself, but rather necessarily precedes all subjective unifying actions of thought. Okay. So the unity itself must be prior to the intellectual act positing unity, because that intellectual act in itself presupposes unity. And if unity didn't actually exist, that thought wouldn't be able to become determinate at all. Right? So we can only think insofar as we already presuppose unity, where both that which is thought, the object which is thought, and the intellective act itself, encompassing it, must possess a unitary character, then that which is presupposed by each intellective act from its very beginning cannot itself be the product of an intellective act. So that intellective act presupposes unity. That intellective act must presuppose unity in order to be what it is. And so if we are to claim that unity is a consequence of that intellective act, then we've entered the realm of unintelligibility, because that intellective act can only exist if there is a prior existent unity. Right? So as Plotinus goes on, if then it is not possible to think anything without the one, how is it possible for that not to exist, without which it is not possible to think or speak? For it is impossible to say that something does not exist, without which it is not possible to think or say anything at all. but that which is needed everywhere for the coming of existence of every thought, noesis, and statement, logos, must be there before statement and thinking, for this is how it can be brought to contribute to their coming into existence. Our thought's requirement for unity itself proves that the one is the necessary condition for all of our thinking and hypothesizing. With its abolition, thinking itself would be suspended. The one is not a product of our thought, not posited by it, since every intellective act is itself only possible if the one has been presupposed. The one is therefore more primordial than thought and is its principle. On account of its need for unity, thought finds in itself the necessity of always requiring its principle. The logical priority of the one before the implementation of thought, which always requires unity, ensures for Plotinus the ontological validity of our intellective anticipation of unity. Since the one is also always presupposed before everything that conceivably contains being, the ontological priority of the one before being is by this means simultaneously revealed, which proves that the one is the principle of being, quote, but if it is needed for the existence of each and every substance, there is nothing which is not one. It must exist, that's not supposed to be there clearly, it must exist before substance and initially generate being. Plotinus' argumentation demonstrates that the one as the principle of thought precedes and makes possible every implementation of subjective thinking, and in this way, it itself cannot be what is posited by our thought. But does it also demonstrate that reality itself is based on unity and is structured as a unity? Here, the skeptical argument is suggested that Plotinus does not demonstrate the unity of thought and being as it is so understood, but rather always presupposes it. But a skepticism that questions the affinity of the fundamental structure of our thought with the fundamental structure of being enmeshes itself in self-contradiction. If the anticipation of unity that first makes thinking possible and therefore precedes it should not be sufficient to ensure the ultimate unity of reality, then one must concede the possibility that reality by itself, independently of our thought, might also consist of a disunited multiplicity of disconnected individual things. Yet it is precisely this assumption that claims already unitary classifications of thought, such as actuality, multiplicity, or individual things as stable reality. By doing so, it also presupposes the stability, it already presupposes the stability of reality attained by our classifications of thought, that is, the anticipations of reality that make it possible. Therefore, it presupposes the argument that it wants to dispute. A presupposition that is presupposed even when attempting to deny it, however, cannot be disputed. And then you'll see on the next page, being for Plotinus primarily signifies determinacy, and so on. Benjamin, did you have something?
Assalamu alaikum, Sidi.
Alaikum salam. How are you,
I think my question was already answered by the second part.
I have, Hasan.
Yeah.
Yeah. Your formidable Teutonic mind needed another Teutonic mind to be satisfied. That's why I read on. I was like, oh no, Benjamin's asking me a question. I went into panic mode. So I was like, I'll just keep on reading Jens Hafassen and hopefully it will go away. And it worked, alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah.
I tried to find the original of this of the book.
Yeah.
But it's a kind of so the first half I think is an introductory book that's in print in German. But
yeah.
The second half is something like 4 articles or something.
Yeah.
That were published in different journals and then translated into English.
Okay. Yeah. He was a formidable figure in Germany and everywhere.
So yeah. Could you mention from which part of the book this excerpt was? Was it from the...
It was page 25.
Okay, so that's probably the introduction.
Yeah, it's a chapter. It's a chapter. Is it chapter 1? Chapter 3, the Metaphysics of the One. Yeah, there must be short chapters. Yeah, it's an amazing book. Sada.
so Sheikh, I have a question. You can obviously relegate if it's not relevant. But with regards to the one, obviously it was mentioned earlier that, you know, talking about the one without any sort of determinacy doesn't mean that, for example, I mean, it's still true that God exists, God has power, God has life. How, I just wonder, like, how can we say those statements? Because those distinctions, we're not predicating that on the essence, and then we're also saying at the same time that the essence, you know, is in, you can't speak with any sort of determinacy. Is it? Yeah, we know that it's the source of that sort of distinction, but even still, that statement, God exists. It's you know, sort of distinction that we're making on something that we can't make distinctions upon.
It doesn't mean where it's important not to misunderstand what this kind of apophatic theology is actually saying. And I think it's a very good question. This is an issue that a lot of people have, and this is something we should probably gather really apposite sources together and have a session on it, because I think it's very much worth discussing. There's a lot in Sheikh al-Akbar about this, a lot in Platonic, a lot of it in Pseudo-Dionysius, and there's a lot all over the place. So when there's a very important distinction to be drawn between, as Maulana Karim Laham put it when he was posed a similar question, there's a difference between ineffability and unintelligibility. So the God always surpasses our concepts, right? But that doesn't mean when we come to the edge of the waterfall, right, that we don't legitimately encounter the source of these qualities, who must possess those qualities in a super essential manner, right? So there is a common thread of intelligibility. There isn't this sudden break in intelligibility, like you get to a certain point and then, as the objection to all this goes, well, you're just saying that God is nothing. No, we're not saying God is nothing. We're saying that, as Douglas Headley puts it, the one beyond being always contains a surplus of meaning that transcends our finite concepts. And so, as there's a quotation in my book from Dastur al-Ulama about when we talk about what is exactly the same as beyond being, by the way, when we say that Allah Ta'ala is mutlaq hatta an qayd al-itlaq. So God is absolute, he's mutlaq. Even saying he's mutlaq from that, right? Which is, you know, maybe it's just a kind of apophatic enthusiasm, but yes, God has to be the wise. He has to be the all-knowing. He has to, the ultimate principle, the one, must be, and that is a true and necessary and real judgment. And we have some real knowledge of God's nature when we say that, and it is moving from the athar to the ma'athir, it's moving from the effect to the cause of these qualities. They must be contained in the creator. That doesn't sound right. Then I said, I was about to say something even worse, which is they must be embodied in the creator. No, they're not contained or embodied in the creator, but he must exemplify. No, that's even worse. The point is, our concept can't get there, right? But God possesses these names and qualities. That's what it says in the quotation of Dastur al-Ulama. It shouldn't be understood when we say that God is mutlaq hatta an qayd al-itlaq, that he doesn't possess all the names, that he doesn't possess all the attributes, right? He does. Again, possess is the wrong word, but but in his essence, unknowable essence, knowable only to himself, as it says in that quotation, it is just that there is no concept or name, right? So the point being made is not the unintelligibility of God, it's the ineffability of God. What it means is that he transcends all of our attempts to grasp him. It doesn't mean our attempts to grasp him are all false and wrong, right? And Plotinus, he was about as apathetic as it gets. He has certain places where he said, well, why is it we're allowed to call God the one and the good and the beautiful and self-love, which he is called, and pure will, he's called pure will in 6.8. It's not that, the people tend to make assumptions that he's only called the one, and it's this desert of barren unity. It's just not the case. He's dunamis ton panton. He is the power to be all things. He is virtually all things, even in Plotinus. Dunamis ton panton, in the infinite plenitude. And it's not this kind of 1 + 1 = 2, but you can think of it in the sense that, being composite, being determinate, that's limitation. That's not having power, right? The more determinate you are, the more complex you are, the more in need you are, the less powerful you are. But when you get rid of all of the qiyud, and I'm going to say this as much as I hate to say, but pure being, once you get rid of all the qiyud, that is pure power to be all things, right? That's one way of thinking about it. I mean, you have to be careful with that line of thought, but so I'd say that's a general answer. Does that help?
Yeah, I think you pretty much answered it when you said it means so in a superordinate manner.
Super essential and subordinate, yeah.
Yeah, so when we say the statements are true, and we understand it in a specific way, but the understanding in its most real sense, obviously that's beyond us. So yeah.
That's what it's saying. It's a misunderstanding to think that anything that we say about God, because it's determinate, that means it's not true. That's not the case. What it's saying is it always surpasses our concepts.
Does that make sense?
Oh, hello. Does anyone have anything about that which could benefit us? How are you, Maulana Niaz?
Alhamdulillah.
Alan, are you in, did you say you were going to Bursa?
Yeah, actually, I was late because I just a few hours earlier, I visited the maqam of Mullah Finnari.
Allah, mashallah. Yusuf went there.
Sent all of your salams.
Mashallah.
So alhamdulillah, and then to Ulu Jami. So I was a little bit late today. So yeah.
I'm so sorry not to have responded, Maulana.
No rush.
Distracted because of my house move and everything.
There's no rush.
Forgive me.
Inshallah, when you're ready. We actually read something about what you're saying in Ibn Sina. I think it's Al-Maqalat al-Khamsa, Al-Khamisa, where he mentions the same thing about the idea of the Mahiyya. The Mahiyya, the discussion in the ilahiyat between about the existence of the kulli, right? And the kulli versus the essence, the mahiyya of a thing, and how the mahiyya is not bound by quyud like kulli or juzi and things like that. But it does have the quality of being one. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
So there's some interesting debates there between kulli and juzi and the mahiyya in Maqalat al-Khamisa in the Ilahiyat of Ibn Sina as well. Which we were reading with, I mean, there's so much detail in there. I'm gonna have to read it at least 10 times.
Yeah, it's very, absolutely.
But it was our class with Dr. Umar about it was quite fascinating, and it had the same thing, which is, devoid of quyud, but inescapably one. It was very, very interesting. Yeah.
MashaAllah, beautiful. Oh, I wish we could sit in Dr. Umair's lessons, but
You can just come down and sit.
inshallah.
Yeah.
Okay. They're all in Turkish, aren't they?
Well, to be honest with you, I encouraged him to give a class in English because he could teach in English. And I'm trying to push him to do that one of these terms. So we'll see if he can be convinced to do that one day.
Inshallah.
Yeah, inshallah. We'll see.
Wonderful. Maulana Niaz, do you have the book or should I get someone else to read?
Yes, I do.
Can we go from "it has often been commented" on page 41?
Yes. Okay. It has often been commented, quite justly in our opinion, that Kant's separation of the understanding and reason, which he had not yet presumed to undertake in the inaugural dissertation, is quite lacking in serious philosophical justification. It seems rather to be a requirement of the internal coherence of his project, given his own assumptions about his contrast between the legitimate use of concepts in fusion with intuitions and their illegitimate use, that is, their independent use. But which concepts, one wonders, is Kant employing to carry out his critique? Neither kind is eligible. When Kant critiques reason, he is certainly not applying concepts to sensible intuitions. And on the other hand, he is scarcely going to admit to have been indulging in the, quote, illegitimate constitutive use of concepts. But more on this later. These assumptions are in turn only justified by Kant's prior assumptions about the radical separation of sensibility and understanding, the effective priority of the intuitions of sensibility in providing singular representations, the a priori forms of sensibility, time, and space, which are in direct informing relation to the matter of sensibility, sensation. Intuition, quote, is immediately related to the object and is singular. And although the object, quote, constituted by our faculties in Kant cannot be actualized and is indeed blind without also being informed by the concepts of the understanding, and is indeed, quote, blind without also being informed by the concepts of the understanding, these concepts of the understanding cannot provide the singular framework for empirical objects that time and space do, but are of merely, quote, general application with respect to themselves. Indeed, as we have already noted, there is for Kant no faculty of intellectual intuition that would allow us to directly cognize non-sensory realities or any putative intelligible world rooting our categories and ideas of reason. Such a faculty, Kant tells us, quote, lies absolutely outside of our faculty of cognition. A non-sensible intuition is something, quote, the possibility of which we cannot in the least represent. But he offers precious little more in the way of warrant for banishing intellectual intuition from the bounds of real possibility. Just as little, indeed, as he had offered in his, granted, considerably more modest dissertation. In his critical analysis of the possibilities of human cognition, then, Kant believes that he has conclusively shown, so that it is, quote, established forever, that synthetic a priori truths are possible in physics and mathematics, but impossible in metaphysics. It is this revolutionary conclusion that justifies Kant in thinking he has forever changed the course of philosophy. Indeed, he has, but it is unfortunate that this is not because his philosophy is true.
So if we go back to, I will read these notes and I will come to an end with our reading of this for today. So note 54. So the question is, what kind of concept is Kant using to actually do his critique when he's saying you can't do this? So when he's saying you can't do this, what concepts is he using? Because that's a knowledge claim. So what it's saying here is, it seems not to be a distinction rooted in an honest attempt to uncover an integral metaphysics, but rather just one of the exigencies of the requirements of the internal coherence of his project, this distinction between reason and understanding. What justifies him in making the distinction between concepts which are good concepts because they're applied to empirical objects, and concepts which are bad concepts because they're not applied to empirical concepts? And this is the great defeater of Kant's project, which is, well, which type is he using to carry out his critique? So which concepts? So it seems rather to be a requirement of the internal coherence of his project, given his own assumptions about his contrast between the legitimate use of concepts in fusion with intuitions, which is experience, possible experience, that's all that can really be known, but still that known is good enough for getting on with physics and mathematics and the whole Enlightenment project. So anything which claims to be independent of experience can't be real. So it seems to be a requirement of the internal coherence of his project, given his own assumptions about his contrast between the legitimate use of concepts in fusion with intuitions and their illegitimate use, that is, their independent use. But which concepts, one wonders, is Kant employing to carry out his critique? Neither kind is eligible. When Kant critiques reason, he is certainly not applying concepts to sensible intuitions, and on the other hand, he is scarcely going to admit to have been indulging in the illegitimate constitutive use of concepts. More on this later. So in note 54. Granted, Kant does admit of a certain beneficial regulative use of the concept of reason, in that it may, quote, serve the understanding as a canon for its extended and self-consistent use. Remember, the understanding is the one that's as applied to empirical concepts. Serve the understanding as a canon for its extended and self-consistent use, through which it cognizes no more than it would cognize through its concepts, yet in this cognition, it will be guided better and further. So what he's saying is, reason can talk about the understanding's use of the categories. Right, that's allowed. C, A, 329, etc. And then Kant's appendix to the transcendental dialectic. Remember, he has there's various parts of the critique, the transcendental aesthetic, the transcendental analytic, and the transcendental dialectic. On the regulative use of the ideas of pure reason, so they correspond to the various faculties. The transcendental aesthetic is about the intuitions, transcendental analytic is about the categories, and transcendental dialectic is about reason. On the regulative use with ideas of pure reason from A64.3, etc. onwards, quote, everything grounded in the nature of our powers must be purposive and consistent with their correct use if we can guard against a certain misunderstanding and find out their proper direction. Thus, the transcendental ideas too will presumably have a good and consequently immanent use. See, immanent equals good for Kant, as you can see, have a good and consequently immanent use, even though if their significance is misunderstood and they are taken for concepts of real things, they can be transcendent in their application, and for that very reason, deceptive. Let's not forget, transcendental for Kant is a good thing, transcendent is a bad thing. Transcendental is fine, and then the objects of knowledge are immanent. And the transcendental is not claiming to describe the nature of being, it's rather enumerating the necessary conditions presupposed by experience, and what they really are is the necessary conditions under which, or in terms of which, or which constitute our cognitive apparatuses. So intuitions, concepts of the understanding, reason, right? No, leave out reason. So, but that which is presupposed by experience, right, a priori. So Kant does not, of course, Kant does not, of course, claim to be using pure ideas of reason in order to establish his critical procedure. So transcendental is what I just described. Transcendent is when you're positing or claiming to uncover an actual real ontological structure of reality. That's bad. Transcendent in that sense is bad. Kant does not, of course, claim to be using pure ideas of reason in order to establish his critical procedure, but he does claim that reason provides the understanding with the systematic unity enabling it to extend, quote, overall possible empirical cognition of objects, although not, of course, as a constitutive principle, but merely as a regulative principle. It is interesting to note that Kant's conclusions about immanent objects can certainly not themselves be construed as merely immanent. Take the first assumptions, I'm using that instead of first principles. Take the first assumptions of the critique, like, again, quote. This is not a quote in the sense that, so I shouldn't say quote, but this is summing up Kant's position on the matter. Again, so like, these are his first assumptions, like the understanding and the sensibility are separate faculties. Does that correspond to reality, or does that correspond to nafs al-amr ayyuha al-Kant or not, right? Like, they are the sine qua non of real knowledge. Does that correspond to reality or not, Kant? We have no faculty of intellectual intuition. Does that correspond to reality or not, Kant? The categories cannot exist extramentally embedded in things in themselves. Does that correspond to reality or not, Kant? Time and space are mind dependent. Same thing. The ideas of pure reason intrinsically yield transcendental illusion. Same thing, etc. These are not immanent objects, but intelligible judgments that purport, while obfuscating the question of whether they do so purport, to depict things as they really are, all the while possessing no corresponding objects in Kant's favored fusion of intuition and concept. Of course, much more needs to be said about Kant's fascinating transcendental dialect, and that section of the CPR will be examined more comfortably in our forthcoming book, inshallah. So that's that. And then 55, it says, yeah, that's another thing. You can have a look at that if you want. I'm not sure we should necessarily get into it. Just a side point. But the interesting one is number 58. Because as we discussed when Kant critiqued Plato, one of the most fundamental foundations of Kant's philosophy, again, is the rejection of intellectual intuition. So he believes in intuition, but he doesn't believe that you can have intellectual intuition, i.e., an intuition into the actual structure of the intelligible world. But you'll see here, indeed, the dogmatic ruling out of intellectual intuition constituted one of the major dissatisfactions of which the newly appearing German idealist thinkers complained. As Pippin notes, intellectual intuition is just what Fichte, Schelling, and in some ways Novalis, in some different way Hegel, insisted we did indeed have. One strain in such an emerging school of thought, tied especially to Fichte, had it that Kant himself had to be availing himself of some such potency, given that his own determination of the forms of experience amounted to an a priori determination of content. And even that the apperceptive character of experience, the way we must be said to be in some self-relation in all relations to objects, was already a manifestation of such an unusual faculty. By Kant's own theory, such apperceptive activity was neither a judgment nor a manifestation, in a sense, so it seemed already close to a form of intellectual intuition. We have already seen Walsh coming to a similar conclusion. And next time, inshallah, we'll show how these arguments were made, and very similar arguments in the early reception of Kant, and then how this metacritical problem developed, which is, so the metacritical problem again being the question of, well, it's all very nice and lovely and very impressive what Kant's doing here, but how on earth can he think based on his own principles that he's justified himself in doing so? How can he come to these grand conclusions about the way reality really is, when his whole point is we can't know what reality really is? How can he employ forms of reason which are not rooted in the very prescriptions for legitimate forms of reason which he insists upon, right? And again, if what you believe is just what you want to believe, then sure, you can still be a Kantian. But from any genuine traditional philosophical perspective, that is a burhan qat'i that Kant's philosophy is false. So I think it's quite a significant line of critique, which is not adequately well known or employed or generally understood. And because Kant's assumptions really are the engine of modernity and lie at the heart of modernity in so much philosophical activity that followed, this is really, I think it's very, very important for Muslims to know and understand. And the thing is, on the imminent critiques of Kant don't really manage to work this out very well. They grasp at it, but they don't really get there. They don't really deal with Kant's fundamental shubha either.
I just had a reflection, which I don't know what you think of it, but it's interesting because Kant's philosophy it seems intrinsically anti-hierarchical, because both Platonism and Kantian metaphysics affirm this idea of this ineffable reality that exists. But for the Platonists, that ineffable reality is sort of consistent with the rest of reality, and it's that reality that we experience. But for Kant, it's more or less completely like munfasila, completely separated. And in that sense, because there isn't a hierarchy from true reality to experiential reality, it probably leads to the lack of hierarchy in everything that comes out of that.
Oh, definitely. So, yeah. Subjectivism is fundamentally anti-hierarchical. Absolutely. I mean, if nothing's really corresponding to reality, you can have what appears to be a hierarchy. And of course, we have lots of conventional hierarchies in the world, which no one thinks are oppressive. But the truth is, it's the conventional hierarchies which are oppressive. It's not the real hierarchies. Real hierarchies are not oppressive. It's conventional hierarchies that are oppressive. So, and it's, that very belief that there are no intrinsic hierarchies legitimates the idea that you can do whatever you want with the conventional hierarchy as long as there's consent and that kind of thing. It's a very problematic belief. But yeah, I think so. I think Kant's definitely but all of the philosophers of modernity are very anti-hierarchical.
It's just interesting because it all seems to stem from the way they look at that reality. Whereas obviously there's a complete sort of consistency with that reality.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the major failings of Kant's philosophy, which was picked up very, very early on, and really no one can really deny it, including Kant himself, is this idea that things in themselves actually exist. There is an interpretation of Kant's philosophy by Henry Allison, where they don't exist, which I think is just not credible and it's just one of those things that pops up in modernity, and people will go along with it. They'll go along with anything. But it's not the Gaia, who's probably the greatest Kant scholar of the last few decades, opposes him on that view, and the vast majority of Kant scholars oppose him. But his idea that things in themselves, yes, there must be things, and unknowable things in themselves, yes, they must exist. And they must cause sensation they must cause, I shouldn't say they cause sensation, they must cause the infial, which takes place and that provides us with content. So the content gets filtered immediately by intuitions and concepts, and so we don't know what it would actually. It's actually a really absurd philosophy when you really think it through. But his idea is that we are affected by something which we don't know, and we know that because there is more to experience than just those a priori conditions. There's also the actual content. We have a world, right? But we can never know what that world really is because we are imposing those a priori conditions onto whatever it is. That's his idea. But what's he doing there? For example, he's using the category of causality for things in themselves.
Yeah. Things
in themselves are allowed to cause. Right, and that is a very common. That was picked up from the earliest days. So this is a really important thing. Also, just because something becomes sharia, it doesn't mean that it's true or that it has any cogency. It's just there were certain conditions. There are socio-political conditions. There are emotional conditions. There are psychological conditions. There are other conditions which. That's the spirit of the age. That's what's going to catch fire. But Kant was comprehensively refuted while he was still alive. Comprehensively. So,
including this Metacritique,
sorry, including the Metacritique. That's what we're about to see.
Because it seems obvious. You made it like geniusly simple, but it's very difficult to imagine that people could not see this when he offered his idea.
No, I didn't make it. I just did the best version. No.
But it's very obvious to say this critique once you explain in theory. It's an obvious objection.
It's really obvious. But actually, Samil made it up before I'd even heard of it. Yeah, the other day he did the whole Metacritique. He just like put up his hand and. It's really interesting. When you look at it from the perspective of traditional metaphysics, a really rooted metaphysics of henology, then you then it becomes much more interesting. What you find is, this is also very interesting. Once we've discussed the people who came just after Kant, who engaged in various types of metacritique, you find the modern people who do it. And the thing is, the modern ones don't do it from a rooted metaphysical perspective. It's really interesting, the difference, because they can see the same problem, but they have absolutely no way to deal with it whatsoever. And so they end up coming up with very interesting solutions that they think are solutions, like, for example, turning Kant into a pragmatist, that he doesn't even believe his own philosophy is true, just that it works, right, for some sort of purpose, which Kant definitely wouldn't have accepted. But ironically, I mean, maybe not so ironic, maybe, inevitably, those philosophies are exactly the philosophies that Kant himself didn't hold, but Kant spawned, because pragmatism was spawned by Kant in terms of especially his critique of practical reason, just as positivism was spawned by the critique of pure reason, right? But he wasn't a positivist or a pragmatist, but they both came from Kant. And then there's no surprise that they later say, well, you can make sense of it if you make him a pragmatist. Why? Because actually his philosophy doesn't make sense. It's not consistent. So the thing you're going to turn to are those natural distortions which did arise from his philosophy. You can say, oh, well, it must be because he's that. but he's not. As we will see, he very clearly disavows all of those things. So.
I remember, Sidi, you and Dr. Karim, you mentioned earlier the verificationism. It was discredited because every truth must have an empirical reason, which seems to be a similar claim because it's meta theory. It's
very
not
simple
by itself. So
very,
it's the same
very
critique
similar
against the Metacritique here.
Yeah.
Why people spotted this critique and discredited verificationism, why they didn't do it with Kant?
Because Kant's a much sneakier character. He's a much trickier character. You know, A.J. Ayer was like 24. He wrote this book, and it was in the air, the whole Vienna Circle thing, and he was just I think, you know, Carnap and these other Schlick or whoever, whatever it's called, I can't even remember. They were, you know, a bit more circumspect. They could probably see that coming, and they were like, okay, we're just not going to go there. But A.J. Ayer would just, you know, he wanted to. He had that, you know, the zealous, fervent fire of youth, and he just wanted to go out and state the verification principle, which was in the air, is what I'm saying, but no one had come out and explicitly stated it. Their project was to reduce all intelligible discourse to somehow reduce it to sense data. That was their project, but he came out and stated it, kind of stated the obvious, and he kicked himself in the foot. So that was a really notable instance of philosophical progress, because there's no philosopher who believes that now, and at the time that was the shout. So that's interesting. But again, that didn't make them turn to genuine traditional metaphysics. It just made them. It committed them even more strongly to this reductionist analytical philosophical project. But since they found that they couldn't be realists about as positivists, and their positivism couldn't be objectively true. They said, well, let's just all be pragmatists instead, and you know, make ourselves look like we're really clever by saying, oh no, it's not that it's actually true, it's just a model, and it's just more probable, or you know, according to, again, not to nafs al-amr, because that'd be a problem, but it's just according to our, you know, our coherence theory of truth, you know, and then you just get lost in these models, and no one even believes that objective truth is a goal anymore. And it's just pragmatic nonsense, and it's unbearable. And then that's why the status, you know, you have this total inhidad of the status of philosophy, because it's not even aspiring to those goals anymore. So, and that's exactly what Quine wanted. You know, Quine was an integral member of the Vienna Circle, student of Carnap, and he became the dominant voice in an analytic philosophy, and he made those adjustments so that his philosophy became positivism, but without the verification principle, and instead adopting pragmatism and behaviorism and just every horror that you can possibly think of. That's Quine, right? But that was the dominant philosophy. I mean, he's really the dominant figure of analytic philosophy in the second half of the 20th century. No wonder philosophy's died. Is there anyone who perhaps online or anywhere has?
Salam.
Alaikum salam. Who's this?
Astandia.
Oh, I was hoping you'd say something.
I don't have much intelligible to add to the discussion today. I was just wondering. I think you mentioned a few days ago on the group that you'd be talking about how you're actually a Ghazali and an Ash'ari. I was interested if you had anything to say on that.
Oh yeah. I was going to do that, and then I thought I'd just delay that a bit. I am an Ash'ari. I've always been one. I am Ghazalian. I've always been one. I mean, I shouldn't say that as if I'm worthy of those titles, but I do aspire to be an Ash'ari and a Ghazalian and an Akbarian and a Platonist and an anti-Aristotelian, anti-Kantian, anti-analytic philosophy, all those things, all those good things. I mean, an Ash'ari, because Ash'arism is not a philosophical school. And, you know, some people get very upset when I say that and don't offer any form of response. They just get upset. So, you know, offer me a response. It's not a philosophical school. It's a school of creed. Yes, it's true that Imam al-Ash'ari did say philosophical things and have philosophical theories which were not particularly or directly pertaining to creed, although they were always linked in some way. That's not his fundamental contribution. And most importantly, it isn't what we mean when we say, and I can say this absolutely categorically, and I challenge anyone to prove the opposite or even counter this. It's not what we mean when we say that being Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah means all the things, Ash'ari, Maturidi, 4 schools of law. And then, you know, it's not really true that you have to be a Junaidi Sufi. That's kind of a bit of an add-on. But yes, I mean, the 4 schools and being Ash'ari and Maturidi, that is referring to the points of creed where Imam al-Ghazali disagreed with the Mu'tazila. It's not referring to kalam atomism. And can I give you a very good reason why you shouldn't necessarily, you know, become too reverent when you talk about kalam atomism? Well, it's a Mu'tazili doctrine. It's not an Ash'ari doctrine. So that gives you a very good reason to not think that kalam atomism has to be this wholly orthodox position. And there are a lot of other reasons, but the point is, what makes us Ash'ari and Maturidi, and I'll just focus on being Ash'ari because that's what I said I'd do, being is the points of disagreement with the Mu'tazila. And there is no doubt that Imam al-Ash'ari was right about those. Now, that doesn't mean the Mu'tazila can't be right on philosophical points where Imam al-Ash'ari is wrong. There's nothing wrong with that. Someone tell me why that has to be. But in terms of, let's say, khalq al-af'al, right? The uncreated nature of the Quran, imkan al-ru'ya, right? All of those things. Imam al-Ash'ari gives us a Quranically faithful vision of the truth, which is its very important contribution is in affording the revelation a type of primacy which doesn't entail denigrating the aql. In fact, he cites the Quran, particularly, I'm sure several verses, but in one of his books, he cites أولم يرى الإنسان أنا خلقناه من نطفة فإذا هو خصيم مبين وضرب لنا مثلا ونسي خلقه قال من يحيي العظام وهي رميم قل يحييها الذي أنشأها أول مرة وهو بكل خلق عليم, from Surah Yasin, as a proof for the validity of Nazar. So, but he realizes, and I mean, he's absolutely correct, that the Mu'tazila cannot reduce what Allah Ta'ala is saying when he says, for example, وجوه يومئذ ناظرة إلى ربها ناظرة, reduce and circumscribe and limit what God can do based on certain presuppositions they have about the world, which are not thabit, right? And so there are other, and this is something very similar to what Al-Sheikh Al-Akbar says. This is not a denigration of the aql, it's just inviting us to expand our understanding of rationality and our conception of rationality and what its limits are. So when Sheikh Al-Akbar talks about the distinction between the receptive intellect and the discursive intellect, al-aql min haythu huwa qabil al-aql min haythu huwa mutafakkir, he also says intellects have a limit insofar as they are discursive, at which they must come to a halt, not insofar as they're receptive. Receptive intellect doesn't have a limit, right? But insofar as they're discursive, what the Neoplatonists would call dianoia, they can't necessarily get to the right answer because they simply don't have enough matter to work on. So they will make assumptions about the real structure, rational structure of the world, which don't actually accord with reality because they have too much tasarru'. So again, it's not irrationalism. It's not saying there's a point at which, things don't, it's not saying, oh, like the Trinity, we just can't understand it. Sure, it doesn't seem to make sense to us, but, if you just, God can, it doesn't mean it can't exist in itself, and perhaps God can grant you some sort of knowledge of how it works, even though it doesn't make sense, and all the alarm bells are going off saying, no, shut it down. If only you just have faith first. I mean, that's the kind of pre-Aquinian understanding, which is, credo ut intelligam, I believe in order to understand. No, it's not like that. It's not about unintelligibility. It's about saying that some of our assumptions, basically, we have to believe what God says about himself, and we have to believe that our own frameworks within which we're thinking about the world have to be determined by what he's saying about himself. It's not saying that we just have to believe something that's a palpable absurdity because God said it. But we have to take very seriously what he's saying, and then and when we take it very seriously, not in jumping to ta'wil or saying that it has to be reducible to our ta'wil, then there are actually riches of understanding which are far greater, and the adab ma'allah are far superior. And that does result in a distinctive philosophical, and Sheikh Al-Akbar does agree with Imam Al-Ash'ari on many, many points against the Mu'tazila. So, and I firmly believe that Imam Al-Ash'ari was right, and it is this middle way between faithfulness to scripture and recognition of the role of aql. But that's the Imam Al-Ash'ari thing about why I'm an Ash'ari, because Imam Al-Ash'ari is not, because people will say, well, why are you disagreeing with Imam Al-Ash'ari on lots of points of philosophy? And what I'd say is, it's not me. I mean, who would I be to do such a thing? What extraordinary jur'ah would that be? It's our entire tradition doing that, because they didn't believe that Imam Al-Ash'ari was a prophet. And indeed, there's something to that effect in Faisal al-Tafriqah from Imam al-Ghazali, asking why people are treating Imam al-Ash'ari like a prophet. And people indeed do, and you should confront them, because our tradition wasn't like that. We weren't, why do I talk about card-carrying Ash'aris and flag-waving Ash'aris in this sense of identity? And it's understandable in the time that we're living, that people want an identity. it's because you don't find the word Ash'ari. Go through Sharh al-Mawaqif, you almost never find the word. Almost never. I can't remember ever finding it, but let's say al-fardi wujudihi, maybe it's there, but you almost never find. People are not, and no offense to everyone, but I mean, all this stuff about I'm a Maturidi and the Maturidi point of view, and some of those people, to be fair, they do say, well, I acknowledge the fact that no one ever spoke like this, because the two schools basically became absorbed into each other. But again, this idea of going around and now we're going to do a which I found very amusing, and no offense, but forgive me, anyone who's offended, but it's not my intention to offend, but just to tell the truth, hopefully, as far as I understand it, these edited volumes about Maturidi theology coming out, because they're very funny. You look in the book, and it's all just ilm al-kalam that you find in Ash'ari books. And almost without exception, every single chapter could have been in a book about Ash'ari kalam. I kid you not. Almost every single chapter. But why people want, of course, it would be nice if you could, compartmentalize everything in that way. But it's just not. It's unjustified. So people do today, these card-carrying Ash'aris, when they get offended and their masha'ir are offended, their religious sensibilities are offended, when you disagree with Imam al-Ash'ari, they're treating him like a prophet. Now, on those creedal issues, yes. And there are maratib there. Not everything that you disagree with the Mu'tazila has the same thing. On those creedal issues, yes. Why? Because the Ummah has agreed that is the correct interpretation, right? Including our great muhaqqiqun, and that is that middle way of a balance between faithfulness to the scriptural sources and faithfulness to reason, which is validated by the Quran itself, is the right way. And it would be absurd for us to. But those philosophical issues, he's not a philosopher. It's not a philosophical. And if he's a prophet, everything he says has to be right. But I mean, God, even later Shafi'is disagreed with Imam Shafi'i. I mean, it's very strange. I didn't understand it. And the strange thing is, those who are most fervent about it, they don't know anything about it. You say, okay, well, tell me why it was, and then it's yahrabun. I didn't understand it. Tfaddali. I thought you had your hand up. Oh, you were just holding your hand in that way. Sorry about that.
Siddian, how do you draw the boundary between what is the criteria between creedal matters and philosophical matters?
Well, one's about creed, and it's the Mu'tazila are looking at us, right? Like that one that I mentioned, and then you have, for example, Wallahu khalaqakum wa ma ta'malun, and that difference of opinion about the ma there, what type of ma it is, for example, and the result being God, for the Mu'tazila, it's God created you, and He created the let's say the statue that you're chiseling out, whereas the Ash'aris say no, He's creating you and the action. He's creating you and your action. Right? Whereas the Ash'aris, He's creating you and your action. All of our actions are God's creations. They're created by God. What is the real nature of the Quran? What are the real nature of our actions created by God, and what are the consequences for free will? Interpretations of nusus about aqidah, I'd say. But whereas, what is the fundamental nature of a body? What's that got to do with it? The argument may be made that this is a necessary metaphysical presupposition, because, by the way, the question, what is a body, is not a physical question, it's a metaphysical question. What is the intrinsic nature of what is a body, right, is a question as the essence of a body. It's not enumerating its empirical features. That's why also traditional conceptions, philosophical conceptions of body, they are answers in terms of metaphysical components, right? They're metaphysical, Hule and Sura, Hule and Morphe, or Eidos, he calls them both. They are metaphysical components of the body, right? The body in itself is extension, with all of its empirical properties. But what is presupposed, what is the kind of ground for the possibility of a body, is an answer in terms of metaphysical components. Anyway, so that's why also, when people talk about Hule and matter, and they think, oh, that's prime matter, and that's got something to do with modern matter that they'd study in modern science, they've got nothing to do with each other. Matter in traditional philosophy is pure potentiality, and it's a metaphysical component of a body. It's not. Obviously, there's a huge divergence about what. It's not even in terms of modern science easy to answer the question of what is matter, but it's a different type of answer than a traditional metaphysical answer. But anyway, the point is, those types of things, they're not directly related to something that has upon which our essential beliefs in Islam are rooted. That's what I'd say. Now, the thing about Imam al-Ghazali is the following. People, Imam al-Ghazali would seem to be a proponent of divine command theory. He seems to be an occasionalist. He seems to deny causality, and he seems to be, but the later Imam al-Ghazali is undoubtedly, in that broad sense, a Platonist. He's undoubtedly an Ishraqi philosopher. There's no doubt about it. So people problematize this very much, and I think it's just really a very simple developmental thing. It's true that kind of simplistic developmental understandings are very often wrong, and one of the great victims of that is Plato. But in the case of al-Ghazali, it seems very obvious that he went through a crisis, and he changed and it was an epistemological crisis, and he fundamentally had a fundamental shift in his epistemological beliefs and the metaphysical foundations of his view of the world. And sure, maybe he didn't fully disavow everything he'd said before. Maybe he would reinterpret it in terms of the more that higher form of philosophy. And maybe even then he got one or two things wrong. Again, he's not a prophet, but that's not to stand in judgment over Imam al-Ghazali, which would be absolutely absurd, because what he did was extraordinary. And what took place later, and he sowed the seeds of that synthesis that took place later. He didn't fully realize it, but that's no deficiency on his part. Again, what he did manage to achieve is absolutely extraordinary. But I think he just has so many different phases that people think, well, I don't know where to start and I don't know what to believe about him. But I think it's very clear that, even his views about Hasan al-Qubuh in the Mustasfa, if you actually read it, there are a lot of hints that it's not the straw man Ash'ari version of our moral and aesthetic valuations are just nothing more than pure instinct, and it's a much more nuanced and interesting account. And but if you just read the Niche of Lights, and if you read certain statements which appear in, Jawahir al-Quran, is it called Jawahir al-Quran? Jawahir al-Quran, and then there are disputed works, which obviously Sheikh Afifi in Oxford was working on. And I don't know the truth of the matter in that, because I always wanted to look into it properly, but I never managed to. But then, Sheikh Mustafa Staya, I think he's done beautiful work showing that there is the structure of the Ihya Ulumuddin is in accordance with an Ishraqi understanding of philosophy, and in terms of an implicit structure of philosophical burhan. And that kind of, still brilliant because it's written by Imam Ghazali, but that pretty stodgy wooden form of the older form of ilm kalam, which he continues, which he does in al-Iqtisad fil i'tiqad, it's very clear later that he knows that is inadequate, and it's not, and yet he makes the distinction. If you look in al-Mustasfa, he makes the distinction between what he prescribes for what kalam should be, which he says it should be an ilm kulli, its subject, its mawdu' is al-mawjud bima huwa mawjud ala qanun al-Islam. Now, what is that definition? The mawjud bima huwa mawjud. What's that the definition of? Metaphysics. Ibn Sina, and going back to Aristotle, to on, he on, being qua being, al-mawjud bima huwa mawjud. That is that understanding of metaphysics. So it's the science of first principles, first philosophy. So he's saying that's what kalam should be. And we know he doesn't believe his earlier works in kalam were that. So that should also tell you something. Maybe his project was not fully, I think it's very clear that he didn't fully achieve. And don't forget, he died very young. Did he know he was going to die in his 50s? Allahu alam. But anyway, that's, you've saved, thank you, Asfandia. You've saved me having to do lots of research and try to make that really good and doing a whole session about it, because I can't be bothered. It's really, we don't have to prove to anyone that we're orthodox, or, we revere these people, absolutely. But we also, the fixation on Al-Ghazali is a modern Orientalist fantasy. Because if you look at our tradition, he wasn't prioritized. He was prioritized and he was very much revered, but he wasn't prioritized in the way he has become prioritized now. That's because Orientalists what do they like? They like what they think is nominalism. So to have the philosopher, they like what they think is skepticism. So to have the philosopher, they like Hasha Imam al-Ghazali, and I really don't mean this, because that's not what happened to him, but they like, mental health stuff, right? So they like the idea that, Hasha, again, I would say, I don't mean any disrespect at all, I really don't, but, the idea that someone went through a crisis, an epistemological crisis, well, it seems very modern, so we like that. And they like, this false ascription to Imam al-Ghazali, which is the idea that, this tortured soul then found solace in mysticism. He rejected reason, and he'd already destroyed reason. He was a Kant before his time in his Tahafuz al-Falasifa, and then, it was all mystical flights, because that again accords with the modernist conception of mysticism, which is that it's something fundamentally separated from ordinary epistemological structures and the rest of our knowledge of the world. So they like that, but that's actually not Imam al-Ghazali. That's not how he viewed Kashf at all. In fact, quite the opposite. He was the beginnings of that synthetical approach. So, but he wasn't prioritized in that way. When Tashkar Prasad talks about the 10 greatest masters of al-ilm al-ilahi, metaphysics, in even though he hugely reveres Imam al-Ghazali, all you have to do is read his entry on Imam al-Ghazali in that book, Miftah al-Sa'ada. He doesn't mention Imam al-Ghazali amongst those 10. Later Ottoman scholars had no problem. Again, they didn't treat him like a prophet, and he would be the last person who wanted to be treated like a prophet because he was the furthest thing from taqlid, and we learn how to not be muqallid from him. They had no problem criticizing aspects of his thing, saying he made a mistake here or there. No problem with that. Certainly modern people have a problem with that because they think that they're doctors of the church, that the Pope said that they're doctors of the church. Look in Sharh al-Mawaqif, the most studied book of Ilm al-Kalam over the past 600 years, literally hundreds of hawashi taught all over the Muslim world at the higher level of Ilm al-Kalam. There's a Persian, there's an Iranian, unfortunately the Iranians are the only ones doing good work. There's an Iranian, and hopefully that will change, but there's an Iranian Fahras of Sharh al-Mawaqif. Why are they doing the Fahras? I don't know. Because it's not a, sorry? I know. That's why I study with him, because I need some of that Persian barakah. But the Fahras, why are they the ones doing a Fahras, a 4-volume Fahras Sharh al-Mawaqif, when it's our book, which we studied for 600 years? I don't know. But in any case, they did a 4-volume Fahras. This is the most important book of Kalam of the last 600 years. There are 11 pages of entries on Imam, like 11 pages, like this number, this page number, this page number, 11 pages. There are 8 pages on Ibn Sina, right? And there's less than 1 page on Imam al-Ghazali. That's because he isn't an important figure in Ilm al-Kalam. In the developed Ilm al-Kalam, he's not an important figure. I mean, that's true. He's not an important figure in developing al-Kalam. He's a very important figure in Usul al-Fiqh, because the Mustasfa is an absolutely extraordinary and brilliant book. He could have, in terms of capacity, no doubt, he's a great Imam, written great advanced books in Ilm al-Kalam, but it wasn't then at his time at the stage where it could be written. And he actually showed the way with that statement in the Mustasfa and other things that he said. He showed the way for later people. But again, it's not the case that it's all an attitude of pure reverence. There are things which Imam al-Razi is very critical of Imam al-Ghazali. Again, in the narrative, you would assume, oh, he's just a devoted, wide-eyed student of Imam al-Ghazali, but he's not. He's actually sometimes very dismissive of Imam al-Ghazali. The same, Ibn Arabi has, there are things he says about Imam al-Ghazali which are rated R. Like if there might be a riot or something if you put it into public because it challenges so much, and things which could be construed as very harsh, even though he praises him elsewhere. But people just tend to be black and white. It always has to be either or. But it's just not the case. It's not the case in our tradition. That's just the reality. He's very important in the Mustasfa is a very important book. But again, it was superseded. But it's very important. The other works couldn't have been done without it. But then you have Razi, and you have Ahmadi, and then you have Ibn Hajib, and you have a development. Then you have he's very important in fiqh. But then in fiqh, he was also superseded. So you have that, you have the progression of fiqh with the different people who become the Mu'tamad. Imam al-Ghazali was at one point, but he wasn't the final Mu'tamad, right? Which is al-Ramli and, it's really just al-Nawawi. But, Tajawuz, and you can say it's Ramli and Ibn what's his name? Yeah, Ibn Hajar. Yeah. But in fiqh, he's extremely important. But the thing that you can say, he was never surpassed and never superseded, because he was superseded in Kalam. He was superseded in mystical, in metaphysical Sufism, because the Mishkat is a beautiful book, but it wasn't really the methodology that was adopted. He was superseded in Usul al-Fiqh, he was superseded in fiqh. But the thing he was never superseded in anywhere, including anywhere in the Shia world, anywhere, is in Sufi praxis. The Sufi praxis of the Ihya, that is and remains and always will be the gold standard. But absolutely, I mean, again, Imam al-Ghazali showed the way, but the fixation on him as the key figure in our whole history is just not borne out by the nature of the references to him later and the nature of the scholarly discussions where he doesn't play, he's not even in the top 5 of the most prominent names in those discussions, in most cases.
So to follow up quickly in the difference between, you mentioned Husn and Qubh. So something like Husn and Qubh, because you also in voice masters, you said like this distinction between natural reason and reason goes to once a coin. So you think this matter is something that falls on the side of creed or on the side of philosophy?
Oh, that issue.
Husn and Qubh, yeah.
Husn and Qubh. Again, I take that to be a kind of similar to our statements about our apophatic statements about God. And what I think that madhab is really saying is, or at least what I'd like it to say, but how I do it, how I interpret it, and I think how is the only way that you can really make it coherent. Not only in the sense that we have the exigency of making it coherent because we want things to be coherent, but also actually believing that that's what our ulama thought about it. Because if you consider philosophical doctrines in isolation from everything else, like we do in the modern academy, we sit at our tables and, we're not embedded in Islamic civilization. It's possible to really get the wrong end of the stick. I don't think that the Ash'ari, and again, broad, because they weren't calling themselves Ash'ari, but they were Ash'ari. They weren't calling themselves Ash'ari, but they were Ash'ari. That's what I'm saying, because those things against the Mu'tazila, they were Ash'ari, but they weren't calling themselves Ash'ari because when they're doing philosophy, they're not wearing the Ash'ari badge, right? But anyway, I don't believe those Ash'ari mutakallimun, muhaqqiqun rather, actually believe that all of our, what we construe as ethical truths, like murder is wrong, and all of that kind of very basic stuff, are really just, instinct and the natural infialat of our taba' and munafarat al-taba'. And I just don't believe that. I don't believe that makes any sense with the revealed sources. There are some who explicitly say that that is all that it is, and I think they are wrong. I would say that. I think that they are wrong. But I don't think that that is what is really ultimately intended or should be intended. And I suppose what I'm saying is not an exegetical statement. I don't personally believe that that is what the Muhaqqiqun believed, but I also believe that that formulation is a good formulation and salvageable if you, and more appropriate to the nusus, if you believe that what it's saying is God's true murad, right, and his true, in his af'al and in his ahkam, always surpasses our rational approximations as to its nature and structure. That's what I would say. That's what I believe that it's actually saying. And I think those who say there's no aqli dimension to it, I honestly don't believe that they understand the philosophical masail involved. And again, you might say, wow, how arrogant, how dare you? Well, okay, just give me a counter argument. Give me some reason to believe the contrary. Because if you look at the elements that go into the argument, like Asfandiar, who's a genius of arguments, is constantly posting on Twitter. I know it's you. I've been hiding.
How do you know that? How do you know that?
I know it's you, Eva Lackey. I know it's you.
How has this got out? I'm going to have to lock my account.
No, I know it's you. I mean, it's obvious. it can only be one person. It's not like those hadith experts quite that level, but I mean, it can only be you. So in any case, but it's very brilliant what you do on there, and I think that you're leading the way. Yeah. Do you know Ivalaki? Sorry? Oh, he doesn't have Twitter. Yeah, he doesn't even have WhatsApp. Yeah, I need to get him a smartphone for his birthday. Anyway, no, it's very wise not to have. I tried not having a smartphone for a year, and it didn't work out well. So I eventually got one. But and do you have a smartphone now, Niaz? Because Niaz was one of those people who resisted for years. He didn't even have a phone number.
I resisted having this cheap standard Samsung wooden block of a phone.
Yeah.
Until Sheikh Mashuk ordered me to get one. Then, but I didn't have a smartphone. But then I visited Morocco. Yeah, he ordered me to get one in order to continue our lessons in Mantiq. This was about 8 years ago. And then in 2019, subhanAllah, I visited Morocco, Fez, in the winter, and I was very blessed to spend a few hours with Sheikh Fasil Fihri.
Yeah, mashallah.
Yani the Khatib of the Qarawiyyin, and
yeah,
at the end, he very politely ordered me to get WhatsApp and basically a smartphone.
Oh, okay.
So that's the story.
Alhamdulillah. So we just need to find someone to order over there. Alhamdulillah. Okay, everyone. Well, we've gone on for awfully long. Oh my God. Subhanallah. All right. Well, thank you everyone for bearing with me. This is my last ever session in Cambridge, and we've got an extraordinary turnout. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. It's a record. So that's wonderful. Alhamdulillah. And then I'm going back to California on the 21st, inshallah. So I look forward to continuing. Jazakallah khair. Please keep us, let's all keep each other in our prayers, because the dua bidhahr al-ghayb is one of the most powerful forms of dua. And I especially need lots of du'as at the moment, because I have to move out of my entire house in a week, and it's really quite a challenge. So please remember us in your prayers. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Jazakumullah khair.
Bye.